Hey guys, it's Jessica.
And this is Kendra, and you're listening to
Lucid Lab.
We are back for a new episode.
Yes, no rerun today.
Thank you for sticking with us through the last 2 weeks of reruns. I hope you enjoyed hearing some of those stories again.
Yes.
It's like 6 degrees outside here in Colorado.
It's miserable.
I think it's cold across the whole U.S., so we are bundled up in here on a weekday afternoon.
Yeah.
Just the way life works out. Sometimes the weekends are full of other things with kids and family and obligations. So we're doing this after working all day. Hopefully our voices are more warmed up.
I don't know about that. I think mine is more scratchy because I've been on the phone all day.
Yeah.
I'm excited for tomorrow because I'm taking my daughter to the theater to watch Harry Potter. And she's never seen it in the theater. I think they're opening up every single movie for 1 day a week for like the next 7 weeks or something like that.
So tomorrow's like the first one, what is it, Goblet of Fire? Is that the first one? It's Sorcerer's Stone.
Yes, Sorcerer's
I should
Stone.
know. I haven't watched Harry Potter in years.
I've watched them hundreds of times because of her, and I still can't figure it out.
I've even read the books. I should know, but I can't remember because it's probably been like, I don't know, 10 years.
And are there 7 movies? I can't even count in my mind. Anyway, we can only see the first one because of other schedules, but I thought that is still really neat because she's never had the theater experience of it.
That'll be fun. And always the popcorn. I was just saying last night that I want to go to the theater again soon just because I want popcorn, but there was nothing out that I wanted to see right now.
Yeah.
Which is a bummer.
I always spend way too much money at the theater. It is
me too.
So expensive. But what are we doing today?
So today we're talking about a serial killer.
We've had a lot of evil people lately.
I actually came across this story. I was going to do a mini episode on it, and then I started writing it. I think we talked about this in an earlier episode, and I was up to like 10 pages and only halfway through the story. And so this became my episode. It wasn't one that I had planned out, but after spending that much time writing it, I was like, might as well see it through.
And double the pages from what she started with too. So you never really know what you're going to get into when you go to research.
You don't. I am talking about a lesser known serial killer. He was called the coldest, most depraved killer of women in the city's history, and his city of choice was Dallas, Texas.
Oh.
And the man I am discussing is Charles Albright. He is also referred to as the eyeball killer.
Albright sounds familiar, but not the other part.
So Charles is a perplexing person to study because he doesn't really fit what you would think of as a cold-blooded killer. Someone just casually meeting him, a coworker, or even a friend would not describe him as someone that could be capable of what he does. He was described by friends as a Renaissance type of man. He was fluent in French and Spanish. He was a talented painter. He played piano with the best of them, and he liked to recite poetry.
Oh, so he's a really scary serial killer.
Yes. He would be described as eccentric but harmless. Those describing him said he was even squeamish about watching violent shows on TV. Like he didn't want to see any of that.
Weird.
No way he could have committed horrific murders. And yet, Charles Albright sits in prison today for the vicious killings of 3 women. They were all sex workers from the Dallas area, and they went missing in late 1990 and early 1991. And while these 3 crimes have been definitively linked to Charles Albright, I fear, as we have discussed in many other episodes, that there are far more victims that we will never know about.
Right.
The killings that put Charles away happened when he was in his 50s.
Oh,
You can't tell me that this man who had these sinister ideas in his head only popped up and started killing people in late midlife.
Yeah.
There are some others that people speculate could be connected to Charles Albright, but as we have seen in other serial killers, when their victims of choice happen to be sex workers, it's easier to get away with it. So let's go into Mr. Charles Albright.
Okay.
Charles was born on August 10th, 1933 in Amarillo, Texas. That makes him a Leo.
I was going to say, it's around my daughter's birthday.
His biological mother gave him up at birth to an orphanage where he was adopted at 3 weeks old by a young couple, Dell and Fred Albright. The Albrights lived in the all-white middle-class neighborhood of Oak Cliff right outside of Dallas. This was a beautiful residential area across the river from downtown. Fred worked as a grocery store manager and Dell was a stay-at-home wife. According to the story, Dell Dell would tell Charles as he got old enough, she told him that his birth mother was an exceptional law student. She was only 16 years old, and she had secretly married another law student, and then they found themselves pregnant. When the girl's father found out, he demanded that she annul her marriage and give up the baby for adoption.
How was she a law student if she was 16?
This is just the story his mom told him.
Okay.
We're going to find out his mom's a very interesting person.
Okay.
Charles Albright. Actually, that's my next sentence. She should probably be studied, in my opinion, for her child rearing tactics and the perfect way to create a serial killer.
Oh, boy.
It's always connected to the mom, or many times connected to the mom. And when I tell you some of the things that were going on in this household while Charles was a child, you're going to be like, that makes sense.
Okay.
Charles Albright made sure that Charles knew that she would never abandon him like his birth mom.
Okay.
He was her pride and joy. She loved pampering him. She kept goats in the backyard so he could drink goat's milk. She told him that was better for him than cow's milk.
Okay.
She doted on him and was so very happy to have a little baby of her own after not being able to conceive herself. But for all the doting, Dell was also extreme. When Charles was a small child, she would put him in a little girl's dress and give him a doll to hold.
Oh, darn.
There was another person I talked about who dressed, it was another killer, and his mom dressed him up in little girl clothes.
Was it the other Texas guy?
It might have been. It might have been Kenneth McDuff.
I think it was.
Maybe it's a Texas thing.
Maybe.
I don't understand it. It's like you have a little boy, unless the little boy is like asking to wear little dresses, which kids do.
Yeah.
Like that's normal. But this one sounded like she was doing it almost in a humiliating way, as we'll find out.
Okay.
She would also change his clothes multiple times a day because she didn't want any dirt to be on them. She wanted her child to look perfect. She was also kind of a germaphobe, and this is the 1930s, and polio was actually running kind of rampant in the country. So she was very concerned about that, as any good mother probably would have been back then. But she was overly concerned that her son would get into something and catch polio. And she told him that the way that he could get polio was by touching dog feces. And she was, for whatever reason, worried he was going to play with dog poo. And in order for him to take her seriously, maybe he was, I don't know, but this is just a weird part of the story.
Okay.
She took him to the local hospital to see polio patients.
Well, that's a way to catch polio, you weirdo.
Back then, like they would lock them in what were called iron lungs.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
And she would use this and say, see, if you don't let me change your clothes, if you don't wash your hands, if you touch dog poop, you could spend the rest of your life here. He's like 5 or 6 years old, so kind of weird.
Yeah.
When he was less than a year old, Dell put him in a dark room as punishment. He was being punished for chewing on her tape measure while she was trying to sew. I don't understand. When he got a little bit older and refused to take a nap, she would tie him down to his bed so he could not get up and would have to just fall asleep.
Oh my God.
When he wouldn't drink his milk or eat the food that she prepared, she would often spank him. Her behavior towards her child was strange enough that people around the neighborhood would talk about it. They also talked about Charles Albright herself. She was just kind of an oddball. She only wore clothes from Goodwill, and she always kept a scarf over her head when she went out in public. Fred actually made a very good living. They were upper middle class, and she would never buy any new clothes. She was also very miserly when it came to food and preparing meals. It was said that she would go to the local butcher shop and ask for the old bones that they would typically give the dogs because they were cheaper, and then she would tell them that she was going to use them to make soup. So she was just kind of, maybe this is Depression era.
Yeah.
So I think some of that might just go with the territory. It's the 1930s. People kind of wrote her odd behavior off though and said she's just overprotective because she'd never raised a child before and she didn't know how to be a mom. But despite all of this and the odd upbringing, Charles was a gifted boy. He could do just about anything. Each morning before the school bus arrived, his mother had him practice the piano for at least 30 minutes. She also taught him so much reading, writing, and math that he was moved up 2 grades in elementary school. She also enrolled him in extracurricular activities. Aside from piano, he was also learning painting, tap dancing, and multiple forms foreign languages.
Other than the languages, it sounds like my daughter right now.
This would have been something very different back in the time that it was happening too.
Oh, absolutely.
Kids nowadays are in many, many activities.
Yeah.
And it costs a lot of money.
Exactly. Which they never understand.
One of Charles' childhood friends recalled that Charlie was like a Pied Piper to the rest of the kids. They always wanted to see what he would do next. He was just so much fun, and kids liked following him around.
That's a Leo for you.
It totally fits Leo. Now, one of the most odd extracurricular activities that Charles was introduced to was from his mom, Dell, and that's taxidermy.
Oh, of course it had to be something like that. Wow.
Why? I don't know. But she actually bought him his first gun and even helped him with killing small animals.
Oh, so she literally started the process for him.
That's what I said. She is like the manual on how to create a serial killer.
Wow.
When Charles was 11 years old, his mom enrolled him in a mail order course. That's what they had back then. And it was called the Northwestern School of Taxidermy.
I remember those. I think I did one for being a wedding consultant. I have a certificate
like a
and
mail
then I
order?
never did anything with it.
Now it's all internet. Like you can watch YouTube videos and
Right,
learn this
exactly.
kind of stuff. But back then you mail ordered and you would get a book. Charles started with dead birds that he just found. And his mom was right beside him learning taxidermy as well. So it almost sounds like it was a hobby she wanted to do. And she was like, let's do this together.
Why not puzzles?
Why? Yeah.
Why
I would
dead
much rather-
animals?
Let's kill animals and stuff them. That sounds like a good mother-son activity.
Poor animals. They weren't born so you could have a trophy.
Dell actually taught Charles how to use all of the tools. There was a knife used to cut the skull. There was a little spoon used to scoop out the brains. And then there was a scalpel that you used to cut away the eyes from the sockets.
Oh, okay. I see where this is going.
Yes. And then you had forceps to pull out the eyes. She also taught him how to skin the bird.
Oh.
And how to not cut too deep. Like it's a very precise art, taxidermy.
Yeah.
Because you want to preserve the animal to make sure it looks alive.
Exactly. I've never understood people who take their loved family pets and do this to them.
Oh God, no.
Like how could you defile them like that after they've died?
And that would just make me sad
I know.
to look at
I
my
wouldn't be able to
stuffed
look
animal.
at them.
No.
We're sitting right next to
Your urns.
3 urns of my past animals in my room. And I can't imagine them.
Like little stuffed.
Oh my God.
No. Creepy. I would be afraid they would haunt me.
Just walking into the room and one is like looking at you. I can't.
And I want to pick them up and hold them, but
I
they're just a
know.
cold stuffed dead
And
animal.
they're not going to look exactly like they were either.
No. Charles dedicated hours to perfecting his taxidermy pieces, making sure they looked as lifelike as possible. Once it was time to put the finishing touch on his work, the eyes, Charles would go to his local taxidermy shop to pick out the perfect pair. He loved browsing the displays full of gleaming fake eyes and wished that he could collect them all like how other boys collected marbles.
Okay, so his obsession is eyes.
Eyeballs. But his mom wouldn't let him. Taxidermist eyes were too expensive.
Oh boy, if you would just let him buy those eyeballs, he wouldn't be taking them from women.
I'm telling you, this all adds up. His mother was very frugal, as I already told you, and she said there was a better, cheaper way.
Make what? Crochet eyeballs? Goodwill doesn't sell them.
Basically, she pulled out her sewing kit and gave him buttons instead of eyeballs.
Oh, Coraline.
Yeah. Charles, these were his works of art, and he was a very detailed child, and he was so proud of them, but then he didn't get the final touch ever. So when people would come over and see all of his great works of art, his stuffed birds and squirrels and whatever else they must have been killing,
with button eyes,
they'd all have the button eyes, and he felt like that just kind of ruined the whole aesthetic, which I kind of agree.
Yeah, it makes them more stuffed animal, cartoony creatures.
And then Dell just continues on. She also chided him often, and she did try and teach him to be polite and a nice gentleman. She said, you speak politely to everyone, and if you don't have something nice to say, say nothing at all, which I think we hear from a lot of our moms. She did tell him to respect women, especially when it came to sex. This was her sex talk to her teenage son.
Okay.
She lectured him about the way his father was towards her. This is what every kid wants to hear, is because, about their parents' sex life. But she told Charles that his dad acted too greedy for sex. She told him about how she would just be walking in the bedroom in her bra and panties, and Fred would always try to grab her, and she didn't like that, and no girl did.
I mean, she's speaking some truth, but
but maybe not on an impressionable young boy.
I know, yeah.
In a way, taught him that women don't like sex.
Oh, okay.
I think maybe she was trying to teach him to be more patient and caring towards women, but the way it came across is probably not good. She was so concerned that Charlie might be a greedy lover, or whatever you want to call it, that she insisted on chauffeuring him every time he did go on a date with a girl. Not only are you telling your son that girls don't like sex and setting him up for some weird shit in the future, now you're also watching him constantly, and he can't be a normal boy around girls.
No. Can you imagine? Your mom's like, don't talk to her like that. She smacks your hand or something.
Exactly what
you're
was
on
happening.
a date.
And she would even call the girl's parents to let them know like that they were going on a date and that her son would never be forward towards their daughter. Like, he's a perfect gentleman. So she really just set him up for success here.
It is a fine line, though, because there's a lot of pressure put on moms who have teenage boys.
I think it's important to teach your young boys to respect women, but you have to do it in a less overbearing way. You have to talk to them about how women feel, which I think she was trying to do, but it just wasn't in the right way, because she ended up making him feel
resent women.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the best way to show your child how to be is that they have a relationship to emulate that's actually good.
It's very true. There's not a lot said about Fred. I think he was always off working, and Dell really did all of the child rearing. So I don't know how close he was with his father.
Yeah.
This kind of just the beginning of this is kind of reminds me of Randy Woodfield, because same thing, like his mom and sisters were at home all the time and his dad was gone. There was a weird repression around sex. And then you throw in taxidermy on top of that, and you're just, it's a perfect formula.
Yep. And then he started staring at little girls' eyeballs in elementary school.
So the overbearing parenting coming from Dell actually led Charles to act out whenever his mom wasn't around. He became sort of the class clown in high school. He was one of the youngest always in his grade. So he said that later in life, he was just always trying to show off to impress those around him since they were older.
That makes sense. Especially 2 grades, you said?
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's a difference.
And that's great and all when they're younger, but I do think it catches up to you. Even if your child is super smart, they can't catch up socially when they're advanced too fast.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So he was definitely trying to impress those boys and, try and make friends probably.
And he's probably much smaller than them.
I would assume so. He had his first run-in with the law at the age of 13 for breaking into a neighborhood church. He was also caught breaking into a small store to steal a watch.
He's bored.
Others would say that poor Charlie was just acting out because of his overbearing mother, and she never bought him anything. So of course he wanted to break in and steal things, which kind of makes sense.
When you feel like you're missing out with the new and upcoming things, especially with school, it really gets to a kid.
Yeah.
I see that even with my daughter, even though I consider her extremely spoiled. She talks to me about something every day. I've had to have conversations with her. Can our first words to each other when I pick you up not be about me buying you something else?
And it was also hard for Charles because he's in a upper middle class neighborhood. His parents have money. I'm sure all the kids around him have money, but his mom was just stingy and she didn't spend any money. So it was probably very resentful.
Yeah.
Because he's like, I know my parents can afford it. It's one thing when you know your parents can't afford it.
Right. You can have those conversations.
Yes. But when there's no reason.
Yeah, I understand.
But maybe he just wanted to rebel against her as well because she was such a overbearing person. On top of this, let's throw in some religion. She did make him go to the Methodist church every Sunday. And even in his teenage years, he had a bedtime and his mom made him go to bed at 8 p.m. every night.
Ooh, that's early.
Yes. Dell fussed over him so much that he began to get chronic headaches.
Ooh.
But Dell decided that the headaches were not from her, but rather that he just needed to get his eyes checked. He had 20/20 vision, but she insisted that it was something to do with his eyes. And then she started making him wear glasses, even though he didn't need them.
So she also had an obsession with eyes.
Maybe. Yeah, I didn't even think about that till now. There's some weird shit going on here. But despite all of this, he was still a very bright boy, and he ended up graduating from Adamson High School at the age of 15.
Okay, definitely a smarty pants.
Yes. And he also, around the age of 14, became somewhat of a celebrity in the area, even though his mom and dad never allowed him to have any things that he wanted. Because he was doing so well in school and they wanted to give him a head start, they actually purchased a piece of property in their neighborhood and they just gave it to their son, Charlie. And then Charlie was able to kind of become this little real estate magnate. He sold that property and bought more lots. And the Dallas Times-Herald actually published a story about Charlie under the headline, "World's Youngest Real Estate Man Amassing Nest Egg for College."
Wow. So they didn't give him anything growing up, but they gave him a whole house and land.
I know. They just don't make sense. Or maybe they're trying to
really
teach him
neat
life skills.
in a way.
I feel like the Albrights, like Fred and Dell, are those people that just look like they're living a normal life, but are secretly like multimillionaires or something.
Mm-hmm. I thought you were going to say a car.
No, no, that would be a normal thing to do. This family is anything but normal. There was another story of one time in high school, he wasn't doing his classes, even though he was plenty smart enough to do them. He just said he was too bored to study and he was failing a class, but he knew if his mother found out, he would never hear the end of it. So he actually sneaked into the school office.
He changed his grade
and found the report cards and filled them with all A's and forged the teacher and principal's signature.
Oh, wow.
Perfectly.
Before computers.
Yes.
He was a
back
hacker.
when you could. He also accidentally, I say that in quotes, set fire to his chemistry teacher's dress. So those are some other things he did that got in trouble outside of just the shoplifting.
Okay.
But a lot of people wrote this off as just antics of being a boy.
And being a bored genius or something?
I think so. And they're like, he's super smart. Look at him doing this real estate stuff, whatever. The other part is really just blamed on his parents and his mom specifically.
Okay.
His next step was to go off to college at the age of 16. He was going to attend North Texas University with an intent to major in pre-med and become a doctor, which kind of makes sense with the taxidermy.
Yeah.
He was interested in anatomy and he's really smart, so why wouldn't he? But by the end of his freshman year at North Texas University, he was arrested for being a member of a student burglary ring that broke into 3 stores and stole several $100s worth of merchandise.
That sounds like a cool club.
The burglary club ring. How do you get into that? Charlie swore that he stole nothing and that he was just along for the ride. He said the only reason he got caught is because the boys asked him to keep some of the stolen things in his dorm room.
Oh, okay. So he wasn't the leader of this.
No, but Dell, his mom, got upset and she didn't want her son to get kicked out. So she actually went to the store owners and tried to reimburse them for what was taken.
Oh, okay.
She also tried to persuade the judge to let her act as Charlie's lawyer. She even said that she would be willing to take his place in jail. Just don't let her son get kicked out of college.
Oh, goodness.
But the judge did not take any of it, and Charlie actually ended up going to jail for a year.
Oh, wow. That's quite a while, actually.
Right? Maybe they were trying to make an example because it was a group of boys doing it. I don't know. But Charlie spent his 18th birthday in jail.
Okay.
And Dell was absolutely horrified by this, and she did not want it getting out to the neighbors. She worked very hard to keep the matter hushed up. She didn't want anyone in her neighborhood to know that her bright son, Charlie, had become a convicted felon. It was actually a felony.
Oh, it must have been something expensive.
Yeah, it didn't say, or maybe one of them had a weapon on them. Once he was released from jail, Charlie had a new plan. Now that he could not go back to North Texas, he would go to Arkansas State Teachers College and get back on track with his pre-med degree. He told the probation officer that he was going to mend his ways. He had learned his lesson.
And now he's a year older, so he's closer to his classmates, and he's cooler now, so now he can get dates.
He's got street cred.
Right.
That's my next sentence. You're just helping me tell the story. He began to date a lovely young English major named Betty Hester, and they made plans to marry. He was truly brilliant, especially in science. He made all A's in human anatomy. He was well on his way to pre-med and becoming a doctor.
This is kind of an unfortunate story because so far he sounds really neat, if I'm being honest.
I know.
Sucks that it goes bad.
This is going to keep getting interesting. Like, this guy is one of the most interesting people that we've studied. but something's going to snap and he's going to start killing people. Or it just tells you that you never truly know anyone.
Yes, exactly that.
His teachers were impressed with him. They thought he would go far. He was gifted as a medical student. He had hopes of becoming a surgeon, but things didn't go as planned because Charlie had this urge to begin stealing things again. He was caught at the train station with suitcases full of stolen property from the college.
Okay, so maybe this is where it turns, really.
One of the things that he was caught with was the football coach's golf clubs.
Oh, and it's really hard to stop stealing if you like it.
I think, the kleptomania.
Yeah.
I think he had that maybe. It was a thrill. It was something he knew he shouldn't be doing. And it was like his way to get back at his mom. There's so much psychology that can go into that. He did not go to jail this time, but they did expel him from college.
Oh, man. Although, taking back what I said a little bit, I would still be scared for him to be a surgeon.
Why?
We'd have a doctor death situation, or I don't know.
Probably, actually.
Yeah.
Or you just take people's eyeballs while they're under.
He did like to steal things.
I wonder why he didn't just steal the taxidermy eyes. I guess he was too young.
What? Kids steal shit from stores all the time.
I started stealing stuff when I was junior high. I think I stole earrings from Claire's.
My first was at the gas station. I was with a friend. We went there to buy a bunch of candy, and she's like, "Here, put this in your pocket." It was like those candy cigarettes.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember?
Yes, I love those things. So Charlie's out of college now. He's got a record. He didn't finish his degree, but he felt like he deserved a degree because he had spent time in college and he knew he was just as smart as anyone else that would have had a degree. So he decided to make himself a graduate.
Oh.
He slipped into 3 different offices at East Texas State University. He grabbed all the necessary forms. He copied them. He added his name. He forged signatures and then sneaked them back into the files at the college so it looked like he was a graduate of East Texas State University.
Oh, I think this is like Dr. Death.
He even stole the registrar's typewriter so the typeface on his records would look the same as everyone else's.
Wow.
Pretty smart forgery here. And he would be successful for quite a while using these false documents and a false diploma.
Because there's not really a way to really look into that unless you're calling everybody.
I know. For whatever reason, Betty was still okay marrying Charlie, even though he got expelled from college. She was in love with him. Sometimes us women also just like the bad boys.
Right.
So they got married and they moved back to his old Dallas neighborhood in Oak Cliff, and they had a daughter, and they lived in a house not too far from his parents. His wife got a job at a high school as a teacher. He had family money and money left over, I guess, from all of his real estate ventures. And Charlie, this will begin a lifelong thing for him. He could never really hold down a job.
Because it's not interesting enough?
I think so.
Yeah.
He probably had major ADHD that was undiagnosed, but he could never hold a job for more than about 3 months.
Oh, wow.
But all of the neighbors who knew Charlie at this time said that he was just this happy-go-lucky guy and that he could do anything he wanted to. Like anything he tried, he excelled at. He just got bored and moved along, like you just said.
Right.
He was working as a designer for a company that built airplanes. He worked as an illustrator for a patent company. He was a carpenter for a while. He bought a lathe and just began making baseball bats.
He kind of sounds like me and my hobbies.
He's just trying different things.
Yeah.
He was a big collector of old movie posters. His house would be covered in the movie posters, and he would regularly go to the Venetian room at the Fairmont Hotel to get autographs from the stars that were performing there. Just on a whim one day, he went to a Mexican border town and became a bullfighter.
Oh, wow.
He was Senor Albright from Dallas, and there's posters of him doing this. He still had that Pied Piper-like ability to just captivate people.
Yeah.
And everybody's like, what's Crazy Charlie getting up to next?
Yeah.
And people were fascinated with him. He visited a friend who worked at the beauty salon in a department store. After visiting that friend, he decided he was going to go off to beauty school. He got his beautician's license.
Sounds
awesome.
awesome.
And then went back and persuaded the salon to hire him with no experience at all as a stylist. And he worked there for a few months.
Wow.
He called himself Mr. Charles, and he would spend at least an hour with each woman that came in to get her hair done, and he would make sure it was done exactly right. So he's just this kind of wild character. But one person that was no longer under his spell was his wife, Betty.
Oh, no.
That would get old after a while, I'm sure, if your husband's just off flitting around and you're the one that has to be responsible.
I think Betty is a cursed name. Men don't treat Bettys well.
Kind of true.
Yeah.
I feel like we've had a lot of Bettys that have not ended well in any of our stories.
Right. I'm sorry,
You're
Bettys.
right. I know. You don't deserve that.
You don't.
So their marriage crumbled and she separated from him in 1965, but it would take another 9 years before they actually divorced in 1974. After Betty left, we see Charlie begin to start getting in trouble with the law again.
Because a job every 3 months is still not interesting enough.
No, he's got a proclivity for stealing.
Yep. It always makes me laugh because they never steal cool shit. It's always random stupid stuff.
That's why I think it's an addiction.
Right.
Like, it's just what can you get away with? And maybe some of it's more challenging than others to
How can I
out.
inconvenience this one person?
That's too. So Charlie is living on his own as a bachelor now because he's separated from Betty and he's 36 years old. And he would get a job teaching high school science in Crandall, which is a small town east of Dallas.
That seems more up his alley. Honestly.
Yeah, I think so. The principal at Crandall had been looking for a teacher the entire summer and was ecstatic when this astute man called him up right before the school year was to begin. And according to his college records, Charles Albright had a master's degree in biology from East Texas State University and was working on another master's in counseling and guidance. He was also about to enter East Texas State University's PhD program in biology. That's what he put on his resume.
Oh.
And they hired him.
The thing is he could pull it off because he sounded that smart too.
I think he's like the perfect kind of con man. I think of Catch Me If You Can.
Right.
Charles' students found him to be very fascinating. He had the best stories to tell. They recall on field trips he could recite in flawless Latin the scientific name for every plant he came across.
Yeah, that's why I was saying this is right up his alley because he has listeners. Every conversation is going to be different and engaging and interesting. It was probably the perfect job for him.
They said he would open up like a rotted log and talk about each insect he found inside. He was just like this wealth of knowledge.
Right.
He would drive a green Corvette to school and he wore lizard skin shoes.
Oh, yeah. He's Mr. Bill Nye of high school.
And he was kind of a younger high school teacher at 36, and several of the girls had crushes on him. He was good looking. I haven't gone into, I guess, his looks, but he was a good looking guy. There were several high school girls writing him love letters, but fortunately, he didn't seem to feed into that. Good. He even helped coach the football team.
Okay.
And they talk about at Crandall after a really good play that they remember Charles holding up the football player and carrying him off the field. Just one of those like movie moments. This guy just sounds like a movie.
He was also interim principal and art teacher and choir director.
Probably. But he came across as such a wealth of knowledge and the kids loved him. So why would you have ever thought that he was not what he said he was and that he had forged all his transcripts?
I mean, at that point, does it really matter? If he's good at what he does, what the hell does the degrees matter?
I don't know, but somehow somebody began looking into his records. I don't know if it was part of teacher certification that they have to do every year, but it did come out when they called the East Texas State University and they really looked at it closely that Charles had never attended school there and he didn't even have a bachelor's degree. Everything he had put on his resume and had shown to the school, his degrees, his teacher certificate, because you also need that on top of having a degree, were all fake.
He should have just said that he's a time traveler, so he had to make that up.
I'm surprised he didn't. He kind of sounds like a time traveler. When the principal confronted Charles, he just grinned and admitted to the crime.
Well, this has been fun.
It's like Scooby-Doo.
Right.
Oh, you thought you'd get away with it. And he's like, oh, you caught me. I'm out. He told them he needed to bend the rules a little bit in order to get a teaching job.
Yeah.
And they kind of agreed. It was a victimless crime. It was just forgery. And because he seemed like such a nice, repentant kind of guy, the university, the East Texas State University, after they found out, they decided to keep the transcript scandal out of the newspapers. It was embarrassing, after all, that their school was also able to be bamboozled.
Right.
Charles pled guilty to a fraud charge, and he did receive a year's probation, but no jail time.
Okay.
Some other crimes that Charles would get involved in during these years was getting caught forging some cashier's checks, shoplifting 2 bottles of perfume.
Okay.
In 1980, he was sent to prison for stealing a saw from a handy Dan. So that's like a kind of little
Ace Hardware. Okay.
He actually had to serve 6 months for that.
Wow. Okay. Well, yeah, things are starting to stack up, and I'm kind of sad, but ready for when I have to hate him.
I know he seems like a fun, innocent kind of guy right now. Once again, every time we talk about this, it's like no crime should be overlooked because it's a symptom of a sick mind or something going on. His mother was embarrassed that her son was in jail again, and she told everyone that he left Dallas temporarily to take an important job at a nuclear power plant in Florida.
And he's about to go on a spaceship.
Probably. And people would believe it because that's Charlie. I'm about to get into the part where we won't like him.
Okay.
Because we're going to see, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that Charles' life will really begin to spin out of control after the death of his mother, Dell.
Okay. I mean, that must feel like a massive release, but also at the same time, if there's no one there to like rein you in, what does that mean for you?
My next sentence literally says, without her around looking over him, a repressed part of Charles may have finally unleashed itself.
Right.
As long as his mom was around, he always wanted to be somewhat as good as he could. Now mama's gone. Time for Charles to really live his life. So Dell did pass away of cancer in 1981. It was said that they were not close in her last years. I think just him going to prison again, she was just very disappointed in the way her son had turned out, which I get as a mom, and knowing that you had such a gifted child, to see him kind of bouncing around and getting in trouble would be hard. Charles viewed his mom as a nag. She was always around. She would just show up at his door, but you know, he chose to live in the same neighborhood as his parents. So what do you expect? But she would just bang on his door early on a Saturday morning. She was always asking him to come over and help her with fix up projects around the house. But it was very hard for him, even though he considered his mom to be overbearing and a nag. It was still his mom. And they said at her funeral, he actually went out and bought a new dress for his mom to be buried in, and he was weeping loudly.
Okay.
So now we're going to jump forward to March of 1985, and Charles is now 51 years old. And this is when the first signs of who he really is begins to show. This crime was different than anything else Charles had done. All he'd been doing at this point was forgery, shoplifting, nothing violent. And this was one that he really wanted to keep out of the news because it would ruin him. So he had first met this family in 1979. Just as everyone loved Charlie, he was soon an acting minister at this church. He joined it, and then everybody loved him. He was up in front of the congregation in a robe, reading Bible passages. He was helping with communion. He was singing in the choir. He just seemed like a good member of the church. He loved to help people. They called him Good Old Charlie. He was known to slip a $100 bill to someone who was down on their luck. He was always contributing and helping. He met this little girl's family in 1979, and afterwards he brought them a big box of steaks because they were struggling financially. He dressed up as Santa Claus for the children at the church, and he gave the little girl and her siblings presents. But all this time he was grooming their young daughter. I'm not real sure. There's not a lot of details. This was kept under wraps. The girl's parents wanted the matter to be kept quiet as well, especially among churchgoers. They didn't want their daughter to be stigmatized.
Okay.
But they also wanted Charlie to pay when they found out what was going on. So on March 25th of 1985, in a nearly empty Dallas courtroom, he stood before a judge and he confessed to knowingly and intentionally engaging in deviant sexual intercourse with a girl under the age of 14.
Okay.
Although he would confess to this and take the crime later on, when it did come out in any way, women who heard about it and asked him, he would say that he was innocent and that he took the fall as the scapegoat for someone else. But he would never say who that someone else could have been.
Okay.
So that was his way of kind of writing it off. So that's the first sign we really see of something not being right with him towards women.
Right.
Because up until now, he seemed, like I said, like a normal guy. He had been married. He had a daughter.
Right.
But then I don't know if something just snapped in him after his mom died, but he did sexually assault this little girl, and I'm not even sure of what her age was, but she was under 14.
I'm assuming if it's under 14, then she's preteen, because usually if it's younger,
it's a different charge.
It's a different charge. The only other person he seems to have harmed that was a woman, thinking back to what you've said, is just that teacher with the dress.
Yeah, his chemistry teacher.
Yeah. We don't know if she was actually harmed with that. And it's easy to hate your teachers sometimes.
Right. I'm sure I had some teachers I wouldn't have mind
lighting their clothes on fire.
I wouldn't have done that, but I wouldn't have minded watching. So Charlie was just getting by with odd jobs like he always had, and he still had family money. Perhaps he got some after his mother passed away, although his dad was still alive, so he wouldn't have gotten an inheritance yet. But he became quite the ladies' man when his divorce was finalized, and many women spoke out after he was arrested about their time spent with him, and they all said he was amazing. He's the type of guy that would shower you with flowers and write songs for you, recite poetry, and bring you candy. To one woman, he recited from memory all 42 verses of The Eve of St. Agnes by John Keats.
That's a little much.
I would be like, okay, I'm done after like 2 verses.
Right.
I'm falling asleep. To another woman that he dated around Christmas time, he showed up with a fully decorated Christmas tree and put it up for her and just showered her with presents that year.
Well, that's cool. That saves me time.
I know. Women were drawn to him and thought he was a great catch. He seemed worldly. He had all these great hobbies. He was a fit man, especially in his like 40s and 50s. You know, when you're dating around that age, it's harder to find men that maybe are still physically fit. Mm-hmm. One of them said she was impressed with him because he was able to do 600 push-ups without stopping. And all of them said he was very respectful when it came to sex in the bedroom. He never pushed for sex first, and he was always happy to wait until she was ready. And
he was not greedy.
Exactly. So something his mom had ingrained in him seemed to be working in his dating life.
Right.
In late 1985, Charles met and fell in love with a woman named Dixie Austin. She was a pretty shy widow whom he met on a trip that he just happened to take to Arkansas. And it was one of the most romantic times of both of their lives. He charmed Dixie with stories about nature and art. He took her out in the country and they hunted for salamanders.
Oh.
He said his dream was to find a new species of salamander that could be named after him.
I love salamanders.
She said he was a great lover and that sex with him was gentle and satisfying. He never talked dirty to her and he never wanted her to do anything that she wasn't comfortable with. In her mind, he was definitely not the type of man that would ever cheat on her, and she felt like he really loved and respected her. Just 5 years after his mother's death, Charlie would be attending that of his father, Fred, who suffered a fatal heart attack in 1986.
Oh.
This was sad. He had actually become close to his dad for the first time in his life during the time after his mom, Dell, had passed away.
Yeah, and his dad was probably retired now and
had time.
Could actually connect.
Charlie actually said that his mom was so overbearing. He saw his dad as weak for never standing up against her while he was a child. But when Dell died, he saw a different side to his father.
Yeah, he's probably a gentle, cool guy.
His dad was finally at peace. He began having weekly dinners at a local cafeteria. So Charlie was very sad when his father was gone, but with both of his parents now passed on, Charlie would inherit their money. Okay. And that was around $96,000 in cash, which was quite a bit in the 1980s. He also inherited his childhood home in Oak Cliff and then several rental properties that his parents owned in South Dallas.
Yeah, that's a good egg.
Yes, and he was an only child. He didn't have to share it with anyone. For what friends said were sentimental reasons, he did keep all of the properties in his father, Fred Albright's name. That will come back into play later.
Oh no, are one of these properties his place?
Maybe.
Like he does stuff? Oh.
Charles made the decision to move back into the old family home on El Dorado Road in the Oak Cliff suburb of Dallas after his father passed away. Although the neighborhood had grown somewhat shabby over the years and the house was definitely in need of a lot of work, he brought his new love, Dixie, down from Arkansas, and together they settled into a quiet, romantic life. What Dixie didn't know about the man she was settling down with is that Charles lived a double life and had already been living that way for a while before she even met him.
Okay.
Although he masterfully hid his secrets from everyone who knew him, he was a veteran of the red light districts all over Dallas.
Oh, okay.
Most of the working girls knew him. He was a regular John.
Oh, wow. Okay.
To some of them, he was even their sugar daddy.
Interesting. Maybe this was his way to still follow his mom's rules because she didn't talk to him about sex workers.
Yeah, like he's still respecting them in some ways, but he was able to do things with them that he didn't feel like he should be doing with them. And we hear this a lot with why especially married men go to sex workers.
Right.
Susan Peterson was one of the regular sex workers that Charles would visit. it, and she called him her sugar daddy. Even at the Ranger bail bonds, which was the company she used to bail her out of jail whenever she would get picked up for prostitution, she listed Charles Albright as her co-signer on bond applications. She also listed him as her best friend in the event that she skipped town and the bondsman had to hunt her down. So he was very involved in her life.
Okay.
Another sex worker in South Dallas, her name is Mary Pratt, met Charles Albright when he was temporarily living in one of the rental homes that I mentioned earlier that his parents owned in South Dallas. Those were very close to one of the more prominent red light districts.
Oh, okay. So he was using one for certain activities.
He was, to meet up with the girls.
Mm-hmm.
And Mary knew Charles because he had a brief fling with one of her friends, and he brought that woman over along with Mary to his house, and she said he would often have parties there.
Interesting.
Mary began working at the Star Hotel, which was a prominent place for sex workers to meet up with Johns, and when she did, Charles began showing up, and he became one of her steady clients. She called him Old Man Albright.
Okay.
It became well known amongst most of the women working at the Star Hotel that Charles Albright was a good John and that he was willing to pay a little more than the going rate and that he was respectful. So all of this, he wasn't doing anything mean to the girls.
Okay.
I bring up both Susan Peterson and Mary Pratt as they will unfortunately become victims of Charles Albright.
Oh no. Okay.
More about them in a minute. Charles was making his rounds through all the girls in the different areas of Dallas. With some of the girls, he had a platonic relationship. He would pick them up, talk to them, take them to get a hamburger, and then drop them back off, never even having sex with them, but he would pay them. With others, he had standing sexual appointments. They would always be in the afternoons when his girlfriend Dixie was at work. She worked as a sales clerk at a gift shop in Redbird Mall. Outside of visiting sex workers, Charlie also had relationships Dixie didn't know about with regular women, not even professionals. On Friday afternoons, he had a standing appointment with a married woman who met up with him after her husband had gone to work and her children were at school. She was a younger woman and she called Charles Pappy.
Okay.
She said he felt sorry for her. She was stuck in a bad marriage and she said he was a sweet gentleman and if she ever needed extra money, she would call him and he would just drop it off. But the married woman said that by late 1987, she had put an end to her dates with him because she began to see him getting more and more aggressive.
Okay.
She said at one point he asked her to beat him and spank him like a child.
Okay.
But once again, that's kind of normal behavior for a lot of men. Like, he's not beating her. He's asking her to beat him.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I don't see any like red flags yet.
Okay.
Other than the 14-year-old girl.
Right.
Another working girl, Edna Russell, did remember meeting Charles Albright when her friend Susan Peterson asked her to do a double. So like a double date. She said she and Susan went with him into a motel room and she said he kind of turned different and he handcuffed them both to the bed and he began hitting them with a belt and an extension cord.
Oh no.
And he would start yelling at them, "Scream, bitch, you know you like it."
Oh boy. Yeah, he's changing.
Something has gone wrong in his brain.
Okay.
To bring in some extra money, he did begin renting out one of the tiny homes in South Dallas that his family had left him. They were on a street called Cotton Valley, and he leased this house to a truck driver named Axton Schindler, who had a nickname. He went by Speedy because he talked really, really fast.
Okay.
Axton, or Speedy, was an eccentric type of guy. He was a hoarder that stacked the rooms of the house with trash up to 3 feet high. He lived without electricity or running water. He didn't want to pay the bills. He used a Coleman lantern for light and bottled water to wash himself.
I mean, if he's not home that often.
Maybe that's what it was.
Yeah.
Charlie's friend said he should get another renter. This guy was just too unusual. But Charlie, who had met Axton through a female friend, most likely one of the sex workers he knew, said he wasn't that bad of a fellow and he paid his rent, so he was going to let him stay. And it will be because of this decision that we will gain some strong clues in this case from none other than Axton Schindler.
Okay.
So we are now into the fall of 1990. Charles was living in his childhood home rent-free. He's not working. He's letting his girlfriend, who was pretty much now classified as a common law wife, they've been together for several years, she's working her daily job and paying most of the bills. She also received a monthly annuity check that helped. Charlie was focused on remodeling the house at this time. He was installing new kitchen cabinets and redoing a bathroom. Charles was not good with finances, and in the 4 years since his father had died and he got that large inheritance, he was now flat broke.
Because he was spending it on sex workers.
But we know he doesn't want to work a full-time job. Dixie came home from work one day, and Charles announced that he decided he was going to pick up a job, and he told Dixie that he had accepted a job to deliver newspapers for the Dallas Herald-Times. The shift would be in the middle of the night, waking up at 3 a.m., delivering papers in Oak Cliff between 4 to 6 a.m., and then going back to bed at 6:15 a.m. Dixie didn't like this at all. She felt like she wouldn't be able to get a good night's sleep if he was gone every night and just getting up and down.
This was intentional?
Yes. This was an intentional job, as we'll find out.
Mm-hmm.
On top of disrupting her sleep to take this job, he also told her that the money wouldn't be going to help pay the bills. It would be to help fund his newest hobby. He was playing for the city's senior slow pitch softball league, and he was actually one of the better players on the team, and they had been asking him to start traveling. I didn't know this was a thing, but apparently it was. So he was going to use the money from this paper route to fund this travel with his softball hobby and let his girlfriend continue to pay all the bills. So he's a really swell guy. Not so much. I'm losing.
Oh, yeah. I've already lost it. We're good.
As soon as the 14-year-old girl.
Yep.
According to the teammates on his softball team, Charlie was an amazing guy. He dressed eccentrically while playing. He would always wear bright red shoes while everyone else had black. They said he was always quick to back down when tempers would flare about bad calls from the refs. One of the guys mentioned that his daughter loved Charles because he would give her $5 every time he saw her to go get some food at the concession stand. He was really good at playing this part of the good guy.
Okay.
A few of them did mention one strange occurrence with Charles while he was playing for their team. They were all sitting around on the bleachers one day after the game, eating some candy and just shooting the shit, and a car pulled up with 2 women in it, and one of the other players mentioned that he thought they were working girls. One of the guys was giving Charlie a hard time, as boys do, saying, "Hey, you're not married. Maybe you can go talk to the ladies." And they said out of nowhere, Charles said, "I would kill them if I could."
Oh, boy.
The men were all shocked, and they said this dark presence kind of came over Charles' face right after he said that. One of the guys tried to lighten the mood again and said, "Oh, but we need to have those kind of girls. They're what keep men from chasing married women." Charles responded curtly with, "The hell it does," and then he abruptly left the bleachers, got in his car, and drove off.
Right, because he's been trying this whole time and it hasn't stopped him.
I think that's exactly, it was projection.
Yeah.
It was the first time anyone on the team specifically had ever seen Charlie show any kind of anger. When the team assembled again for practice a few days later, one of the guys that had said that comment was just trying to apologize to Charlie and said, "Hey, we were just shooting bullshit, like, sorry." And this is when Charlie replied, "Well, it's a really touchy subject with me. My mother was a prostitute."
What? Okay.
He wasn't obviously talking about Dell. He said he was talking about his birth mother.
Okay. Even though your mom told you that she was a law student?
Yeah. And in the months to come, a number of people tried to verify this story that his mom was a working girl, including an FBI agent and a private investigator that was working on the case. And they learned that while his biological father could not be traced, his biological mother was actually a nurse who had lived and died in Wichita Falls, Texas. So she was not a working girl. Perhaps she wasn't the brilliant law student that Dell told him, but there was no way they could determine that she had been working in, the sex work trade. And interestingly enough, Charles knew that because several of his relatives said that they had done a lengthy search through court records and he had found his biological mother. And as an adult, he had visited her several times in Wichita Falls. He had brought her gifts. He had even introduced her to his own daughter.
Oh.
It's kind of weird that he would say that. Somewhere in Charles' mind, though, the connection between prostitution and motherhood had been made. And it is possible that Charles Albright, this is just what they think after he gets caught, might have been wrestling with a very twisted version of the Madonna horror complex.
Okay.
He was unconsciously seeking revenge on this mother figure who had disappointed him by taking it out on sex workers.
Okay. And technically, it's both of his mothers that disappointed him.
Yes. But I think somewhere in his mind, he decided his biological mother was a sex worker that gave him up. And so he's taking out revenge.
Okay.
That's just one of the thoughts. He is a complicated person because we'll find out he'll never admit to any of the murders. I don't know. He seems like the kind of subject you would see on that show Mindhunter.
Right. Yeah.
Because he loves to be interviewed, and there are several interviews out there with him, and he toys with the interviewers.
Okay.
What's interesting is, on one hand, he seemed to really care for the sex workers like Susan Peterson and Mary Pratt. He helped them out financially. He bought them dinner. He gave them presents. But on the other hand, he wanted to punish them. So this goes back to that Madonna whore complex. Perhaps he hated what he became in their presence.
Yeah, that's how I would see it. Is it was a case-by-case basis, and it was dependent upon him wrestling with his own demons in the moment, depending on who it was.
Like, he was able to restrain himself around just like normal women, but when he knew that he was with a sex worker and he could really let anything out.
Right. That's why it's scary, and it's a very dangerous profession, unfortunately.
I know. I feel for so many women who end up in that profession. They see the worst of men.
I know, because they feel like they can do it because they're paying for it.
They feel like they own those women.
Yep.
Whatever the reason, Charles seemed to have reached the point where he was ready to become more violent, and he had just put himself in a perfect position to do it. His paper route gave him an excuse to be out at night. He had sex workers who trusted him enough to let him take them wherever. He had his parents' old property just a 10-minute drive south of the Star Motel, where unseen he could carry out all the murders and mutilations that he wanted to. And because the property was still in his father's name, nothing could be traced back to him. Or so he thought.
Okay.
And it was around this time that the first victim would show up in South Dallas. Before I get into more about the victims, I will tell you that I tried to find info out about each of them. But as we have sadly seen in many cases now, if you're a woman in the sex industry, the reporters don't do much to dig into your history like they do when like a housewife is murdered. So unfortunately, I do not have much to tell you about their younger days, their family, and how they even ended up in this line of work. We only know them through those who interacted with them in the sex worker capacity. And that makes me sad. It is now early December 1990, and a body of a woman was found in an undeveloped lower class area of far South Dallas. She was approximately 150 pounds, and she was naked except for a t-shirt and a bra, which had been pushed up over her breasts. Her eyes were shut. Her face and chest were badly bruised. The killer had given her quite a beating before killing her with a .44 Magnum shot to the back of her head. A resident of the neighborhood was so horrified by what he saw that he rushed inside his home and brought out a bedsheet to cover the body before calling the cops. A police officer on the scene immediately recognized the woman as Mary Pratt.
Okay.
She was 33 years old, and she was a veteran of the Star Motel, so most of the officers knew her. The police officers would often see sex workers taking beatings from Johns and getting reports of that. They said almost nightly a girl would complain about a John jumping her, punching her, kicking her, even trying to run over her with a car. But murder was not common, so this was very unusual, and they were even more shocked to see a sex worker as well liked as Mary Pratt.
Yeah.
They said Mary wasn't one to take chances, standing on like the busiest corner waiting for whoever to show up. She mostly serviced only regulars to the area. The police recalled her standing quietly on her corner wearing basic outfits like blue jeans, a baby tee, and tennis shoes. And they even said at the end of the night, she would ask some of her regulars to drive her to her parents' home in the South Dallas suburb of Lancaster. Mary's parents were older and retired, and they had no idea what their daughter was doing to make money.
Okay.
John Westphalen was the Dallas Police Department homicide detective assigned to Mary's case. He knew when he saw her case that it would be a hard one to solve. It was clear that the body had been dumped where they found her and the crime had been committed somewhere else. There were no witnesses to the killing or the dumping of her body. There was little forensic evidence, no fingerprints, and no murder weapon, and no real clear motive. Considering her lifestyle as a sex worker and the kind of people that were attracted to the Star Motel, he knew there was a long list of people who could have done this to Mary.
Yep.
Detective Westphalen drove to the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office to attend the autopsy, and this is where they would discover the most disturbing part of this crime. As they noted, the bullet wound to the back of her head and continued noting other marks on the body. When the examiner opened Mary's closed eyelids, they were all in for a shock.
Oh, they were gone.
There were no eyeballs, no tissue, nothing.
Were there buttons?
There were not buttons.
Okay, good.
Mary Pratt's eyes had been cut out and removed so carefully that her upper and lower eyelids were left completely undisturbed.
Ugh.
The medical examiner was dumbfounded.
Yeah.
This was not an operation taught in medical school. The killer had to know how to slip a knife around the eyes, making sure not to injure the adjoining skin, and then cut the 6 major muscles holding each eye in the socket, as well as the optical nerve. With the eyelids shut, it was impossible to tell that the eyes were even missing.
Interesting.
She said whoever did this had to have had a lot of practice on someone or something else. Quickly, Detective Westphalen knew they were dealing with something quite sinister, and he contacted the FBI's Violent Crimes Apprehension Unit. Through its computers, the FBI keeps data on the nation's most unusual, depraved mutilations.
Mm-hmm.
Bodies chopped up, organs removed, even eyes punctured with a knife. But an FBI agent told him that he found no listing anywhere of such a surgically precise cutting.
Does he keep the eyes?
I can't tell you everything.
He has like a room and they're in jars.
That would this is starting to sound like a movie. I feel like we're in a different story already.
I know, completely.
Like, you start with Charlie and like his upbringing, and now we're to a Seven style of movie.
Right.
Where somebody's cutting out eyeballs.
Yep.
Longtime Dallas cops take pride in acting utterly unaffected by anything that comes their way, but this one truly disturbed the detective.
Yes.
He's like, what kind of person would want to keep a girl's eyeballs?
Someone who was obsessed with them at a very young age.
Yep.
I just thought of something too.
What?
Maybe girls found him so endearing because he stared in their eyes constantly.
He probably did.
And that's why they found him to be honest and
but
all
they
of
didn't,
that. But he was really just looking at their eyes.
He was like, I would like those for my collection.
How creepy.
The eyeball killer sounds like something from like a James Patterson novel or I don't know. Truth is stranger than fiction. You can't make this stuff up.
Yes.
Dallas Police Department patrol officers John Matthews and Regina Smith began their daytime shift on December 13th, just a few hours after Mary Pratt's body was found. At this point, they hadn't even heard about the murder. Only 2.5 months before, the two officers had been assigned to a newly created patrol on Jefferson Boulevard that included Mary's area of working to pick up clients. John and Regina's assignment was to provide a police presence for the area and crack down on small-time crimes such as burglary, car theft, shoplifting, and prostitution. It was far from a glamorous assignment, but each morning the patrol officers would begin their day by cruising down Jefferson, trying to get the sex workers that were still out on the street to go back towards the Star Motel. On a busy day, there would be about 40 women working the area.
Wow.
Many of the women were also unfortunately drug addicts, using the money they earned for heroin or crack.
Right.
They said some girls would work nonstop for 2 or 3 days, never changing their clothes, never even taking the time to eat until they finally crashed back at the motel. Scenes like this did not faze the 28-year-old John Matthews. He was the son of a New York State patrol officer and had grown up hearing stories from his dad. He started with the police department at the age of 21 and had been patrolling some of the highest crime areas in Dallas. Regina Smith, on the other hand, was quite the opposite. She was 31 years old now, and when she decided to become a police officer, she had never even fired a gun, seen a dead person, or been in a fight. She was a former supermarket cashier. She was a graduate of a 2-year fashion merchandising college, and she was the single mother of a 6-year-old child.
Oh, she's awesome.
She had been inspired by a newspaper story about the need for more Black female police officers. Her instructors berated her for wearing too much jewelry when she showed up at police academy. They mocked the way she shot a gun, and they laughed when she couldn't finish her push-ups. But she refused to quit. After graduation, she was assigned to some of the rougher night shifts, and she still would not quit. With her assignment on Jefferson Street, Regina seemed to have found her calling in working with and getting to know the sex workers.
Yeah, I can see that.
She felt it was her duty as a police officer to try to improve people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
She's a good cop.
Yeah.
She would tell these girls, she's like, what are you doing out here?
Mm-hmm.
You can make more money working at Burger King. You don't have to do this.
Yeah, she was a mama bear for them.
She was. She's a good part of this story. On this particular morning, Regina was not surprised to see Veronica Rodriguez. She was a well-known sex worker in the area who was barely 26 years old and had lived a very unfortunate life. She had been arrested for prostitution numerous times. As they pulled up next to Veronica that day, Regina rolled down her window and she noticed a nasty gash across Veronica's forehead and what looked like a thin knife cut across the front of her neck.
Oh.
She said, girl, what happened to you? And Veronica said, "Please don't arrest me. I almost got killed." She told the officers that the previous night she had been picked up by a man, driven a long way south to a field, and raped. She said it was an older white man and that he tried to kill her, but she was able to escape and she ran towards a house. The man at the house just happened to be someone that she knew, and he also just happened to know the man who was trying to kill her.
Oh, this is his tenant.
Yes.
Oh, so okay. That's how he knows
he's going to come back into this.
Okay.
The officers listened, but they weren't really believing it because Veronica was known as a liar. Okay. She just made up stories. No doubt she had been in some kind of fight, but they were like in the middle of nowhere. She ran into a house and she knew these people. They brushed it off at first as another of her pity stories, which she would often tell cops so they would feel sorry for her and not arrest her.
Yeah, that's hard.
It's hard.
If you are known as a liar, it's hard to believe you when you're telling the truth.
It's the little boy who cried wolf.
Mm-hmm.
Yet 2 days later, on an afternoon drive past the Star Motel, the two officers ran into Veronica again. This time, she was sitting with a balding, middle-aged white man in the cab of an 18-wheeler truck. The officers asked him for his driver's license, which he showed them, and his name was Axton Schindler.
Okay.
When Smith ran Schindler's name through the computer, he came up clean except for some unpaid traffic tickets. Veronica started shouting, "Please don't arrest him. That's the man who saved me from the killer the other night. That's him."
Oh.
The officers looked at the address on Axton's driver's license, and it was listed as 1035 Eldorado Street in Oak Cliff. It was not in South Dallas, where her attack had allegedly taken place, so they kind of wrote her off again.
Okay. Well, she didn't really know where she was.
What's interesting is that address, 1035 Eldorado, was actually Charles Albright's address.
Yeah.
What Charlie didn't know is that Axton Schindler had decided a few years back not to list his South Dallas address on his driver's license. He was that eccentric kind of guy that I mentioned before, and he wanted to keep his privacy.
Oh, okay.
So he was using Charles Albright's address on his driver's license.
I mean, back then you didn't have to show a bill.
I know. I guess not. This is probably why they require that now.
Yeah.
They said that Axton became nervous with the cops there and said he had known Veronica for years. He was just giving her a ride to the motel. He wasn't soliciting her for sex. But the officers decided that they were both lying in the moment, and they took them off to jail, Veronica for prostitution and Axton for his unpaid tickets. They were so close. They had a clue to who had murdered Mary Pratt, but they just didn't realize it yet.
I mean, why would they?
So just 2 months later, another victim would be found. In February of 1991, another woman's body was found dumped on the same South Dallas road as Mary Pratt. She was also found mostly naked, and police identified her quickly as another sex worker from the Star Motel. This time, it was Susan Peterson, 27 years old.
Okay.
Her eyelids were closed, and she had been shot 3 times, once in the head, once in the chest, and once in the stomach. Because her body was discovered on the other end of the road, just outside of the city limits, the jurisdiction for this case would fall to the Dallas County Sheriff's Department.
Hopefully it's a normal thing if any murder occurs to at least look and see if there's something similar, like some kind of system.
Yeah. So a detective named Larry Oliver, who had not heard about the Mary Pratt killing, was called to the scene. Eerily, the same scenario unfolded. Oliver accompanied the body to the autopsy room where a pathologist began the standard examination. And when they opened one eyelid and then the other, they saw that her eyes had been expertly cut out as well. When the pathologist mentioned that the Dallas Police Department had had a similar case just 2 months earlier, Detective Oliver did some checking.
Okay.
Within 24 hours, he traveled to the police department's homicide offices to see John Westphalen.
Okay, so they do work together.
It was pretty quick, yeah.
Okay.
It didn't take them long.
I was worried that they wouldn't talk for like a year. And
that would have sucked. Soon there were meetings with sergeants and lieutenants and with the chief in charge of homicide. While police officials deliberately avoided the phrase serial killings to describe what was happening, Detective Westphalen kept referring to the killer as a repeater. Everyone in the room knew that they were hunting for a twisted, brilliant murderer.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who dropped bodies on quiet residential streets when they were certain to be found the next morning. So he wanted them to be found.
That's true.
I think I kind of alluded to it in the first one, but it was like a street of houses.
Okay.
And the body, there's pictures of these crimes and they are just like dumped, very obvious. Like nobody could miss them.
Okay.
He's not even trying to hide it. At that point, the detectives favored keeping a lid on the story. If the press discovered that the killings were linked and turned the spotlight on the Star Motel, the killer might get nervous and start picking up women from other areas or just disappear.
Right.
But homicide supervisors decided that the police department had a greater obligation to warn the community that it might be in danger, especially the sex workers in Oak Cliff.
Well, yes. That's good that they did that.
And then they also decided maybe publicizing the case might bring in some leads because they really didn't have anything to go on right now.
Mm-hmm.
They began posting flyers around the Star Motel and asking sex workers to stay off the streets. Detectives did meet with the press to discuss the 2 killings, although they didn't say anything about the missing eyeballs.
Okay.
However, somehow word quickly leaked to the reporters that the women's faces had been strangely mutilated.
Got to be careful when you're drinking after work.
That's exactly probably what happened, or they told their wife, or who knows. To the police department's dismay, a media frenzy ensued. The murder sent the city's imagination into overdrive. Calls were coming in from reporters all over the country. The pressure was really on the Dallas detectives to find the killer before he struck again. Special undercover units were sent to stake out the Jefferson area and the Star Motel. They began running computer checks on license plates of vehicles that would cruise by just to see if the owners might have any unusual criminal records, but they weren't finding anything. Detectives started throwing out theories. Maybe the killer had gotten AIDS from a sex worker and he was out for revenge.
Okay.
Maybe he believed the old superstition that a murderer's image always remained on the eyeballs of the person he kills.
Oh.
Maybe he believed a dead person's eyes would follow him forever.
I mean, if he was very spiritual, yeah.
Or maybe the killer took the eyeballs to fuel some sexual fantasy.
Or he just really likes eyeballs.
I know. The only thing Detective Westphalen knew for sure was that the killer came out late at night, was strong enough to drag those girls in and out of a car, and had surgical skills. He also assumed that they would probably need a well-lit room to be as exact as he was. So they knew he had to be taking them somewhere. As officers John Matthews and Regina Smith sat in their squad car reading the front page newspaper stories about the 2 murders, they too were shaken. These were women from their area that they were supposed to protect.
Yeah, I'm sure she particularly felt like she failed them a little bit.
Yeah, she's Mama Bear. And she knew Susan Peterson. She said she was one of the most beautiful girls in Oak Cliff. And they said she was fearless. They said if the killer could get Susan, then he could get any of the women. They surmised that the killer must know every corner of the working district because he was able to pick up Susan and vanish within seconds. Nobody saw anything.
Oh, okay.
They also theorized that he must have been one of her regular customers because she's not the type of girl that would have ever let her guard down.
Right. And that's how she disappeared so quickly because there wasn't any kind of discussion that had to be made.
She just hopped in.
Exactly.
They said that she definitely wouldn't have allowed a man to pull a gun on her. She would have pulled out a razor and fought back. Like she was that kind of girl. So they were shocked that Susan was one of the victims. This time when the officers pulled up to the Star Motel, the sex workers didn't keep their distance. They started pouring out of their rooms. They surrounded the squad car and they began to pass on their own personal lists of suspects. The women talked about the men who wanted to tie them up or beat them. And then there was Veronica Rodriguez again telling the same story she had been telling about being raped in a field.
Yeah. Can you listen to her already? 2 are dead now.
But she kept kind of changing her story a little bit. The first time she said it was a white man. Now she's saying he was Hispanic. Another time she said that the man was black. So almost anyone who spoke with her thought she was just spinning yarns again.
Maybe she doesn't actually remember what he looked like, but she remembered what happened.
What bothered Regina the most was that even though Veronica had maybe changed who the perpetrator was, she had never said anything different about the basic story about how she had been attacked and dragged off to the field.
Right.
This wasn't like her. In the past, she would tell different stories all the time and she would think of a new story every time they came, but she was sticking with this story. And so Regina's wheels started turning and she was like, did someone really try to kill her in this field? And could that man who supposedly saved her, that Axton Schindler, know the killer as well?
Mm-hmm.
Or could Axton have something to do with the killing himself? Could it be that the real reason Veronica kept changing her story was simply because she was afraid of the man and maybe knew who it was?
Right.
But the patrol officers didn't really know what to do next. They had already told the homicide division that Veronica claimed to have information. They had mentioned the attack and the possibility of Axton Schindler being involved. But there's this whole police protocol and they're just patrol officers. They can't push these detectives to follow up on this. So they felt like they had done everything they could and provided that information, and that if there was a connection, the detectives would figure it out. And then a third victim was found. This time it was on Fort Worth Boulevard, which is another well-known area for sex work. It's a few miles from the Star Motel. The victim was a Black sex worker named Shirley Williams. She had emerged from the Avalon Motel where she worked as a maid during the day, and then she would do sex work at night. According to another girl who saw her that day, Shirley was wearing jeans and a yellow raincoat. They did mention that she appeared to be high on drugs as she walked alone on the sidewalk. That was the last person that saw her. She was found at 6:20 the next morning, dumped on a residential street half a block from an elementary school.
Oh, man.
In the heart of Oak Cliff. As children walked to school, they could see the naked woman crumpled against the curb. There was an unopened condom beside her body.
What?
Which is just bizarre.
Oh, unopened. Sorry, I heard that, but still what?
I know. Maybe it fell out of her pocket or something.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Guess. When detectives arrived on the scene, they opened her eyelids first thing because they knew, and they found she was also missing her eyeballs.
Okay.
They knew they now had a serial killer on their hands.
Yep.
The autopsy on Shirley Williams' body would show that the surgery had actually been hurried. The broken tip of an X-Acto blade was found embedded in the skin near her right eye.
Oh.
So something must have interrupted him. But there were still no witnesses, no murder weapon, no fingerprints.
Okay.
Worse, the killer had changed it up a little bit. Just as the detectives had feared, the publicity about the case had sent the killer away from the Star Motel and his South Dallas dumping ground.
Right.
They're afraid now that there was no telling where he could hit again.
Yeah.
Once word of Shirley Williams' killing spread, the Star Motel turned into a ghost town. Some of the girls told officers John and Regina Smith that they were leaving Dallas. Others said they were getting out of the business.
Well, that's good to hear, though, that they heed the warning.
A few of the women that were still in a desperate situation and unable to leave moved together to a street corner next to the home of a man who promised to serve as their lookout and bodyguard. So they're all trying to be careful. Cruising the area, Regina and John spotted a girl that they knew, Brenda White. She was a 17-year veteran of the neighborhood. She tended to work alone on a street corner in front of a church, away from the others. The officers decided to stop and make sure she knew about the murders and to be safe. Regina said, "Girl, you know there's a killer on the loose." And Brenda replied, "Don't you worry. I'm going to get my ass out of here. I just had to mace a man who jumped bad on me the other night."
Oh.
She told the officers that a few days before, a man in a dark station wagon had pulled up alongside her and that she had gotten inside the car. He was a white man with salt and pepper hair, cowboy boots, and blue jeans. She said, "Let's go to a motel." And he said, "No, I've got a spot we can use." As a way to protect herself, Brenda never allowed a new guy to take her anywhere but a motel.
Yeah, that's smart.
This is smart. That's why she's been doing it for 17 years. She told him to drop her off immediately. She said suddenly a change came over his face. She said it was like anger, and he began yelling, "I hate whores. I'm going to kill all of you motherfucking whores."
Oh, wow.
Before he had a chance to grab her, she shot a stream of mace into his face, threw open the door, and jumped out. She told the officers that she was upset because she broke the heel of one of her favorite pairs of red leather pumps.
Oh.
But she was thankful to have gotten away.
Yeah. How did he get away himself?
He just drove off.
With mace in his eyeballs?
I don't know. I mean, he's really close. If it's in that area, he could just quickly go back to his rental house.
Yeah.
Which is probably where he wanted to take her. For the rest of the day, the two officers could not shake Brenda's story from their minds. They began thinking about everything the girls had told them since the killings began, and they always returned to Veronica Rodriguez's rambling story about being dragged out to a field. The next morning, as they were checking in for work at their police substation, Regina said, "We need to go run a computer check on Axton Schindler."
Yeah.
They're taking things into their own hands at this point, even though it's kind of outside of protocol.
Right.
They're hearing too much. These are their girls, especially Regina. These are her girls that are getting hurt.
Yeah.
Because county government computers contain more information about citizens than city computers, she and John drove to the Dallas County Constable's office. At the office, there was a constable on duty, and this all just feels like meant to be stars align kind of stuff. His name was Walter Cook, and he agreed to help them. So they pulled up the computer and they typed in Axton Schindler's address that they had from his driver's license, which was 1035 El Dorado. And the name Fred Albright popped up as the owner of the property. They were confused. Why Fred Albright? Where was Axton Schindler?
Mm-hmm.
They punched in another code, and it turned out that this Fred Albright guy also owned property on the street called Cotton Valley. And then they realized, wait a minute, wasn't Cotton Valley in the very neighborhood where the first two girls were found?
And also where Veronica was saying she was raped.
Yes, and ran to a house of a man she knew that she said is now Axton. Then they started researching Fred Albright, and it came up quickly that he was dead.
Right.
But here's where fate kicks in. Regina and John are kind of baffled. They're like, the only clue in the case that we have right now just led to a dead man. And after a pause, Walter, the clerk that was helping them, said, maybe this has something to do with a man named Charles Albright.
Oh, did he go to school with him?
Well, several weeks before, Walter explained he had come to the office early one morning and had answered a call from a woman who would not identify herself.
Oh.
The woman had been friends with Mary Pratt, and through Pratt, she had met a man whom she briefly dated. She said he was a very nice man, but he had an odd love for eyes.
Okay.
She also happened to mention to the clerk that he kept X-Acto blades in his attic.
Oh, how does she know that's in his attic?
Apparently they went up in his attic while she was there or something.
Okay.
Remember, he threw parties, and you know when people go to parties, they just like
go into
sift
attics.
through your stuff. I don't know. Maybe they were
Okay.
up there doing drugs or something. When he asked for the man's name, the girl on the phone said Charles Albright. If any other constable deputy had been helping the officers that day, the link to Charles might have never been made.
Yeah.
But good fortune prevailed, and they began pulling up information for Charles, and it popped up on the screen that his address was also 1035 El Dorado.
Okay.
And that's when they started putting it together that perhaps Axton Schindler and Charles Albright were connected. Perhaps Charles was the friend of Axton that Veronica mentioned had tried to kill her.
Right.
They then pulled up Charles Albright's criminal record,
And it was a rainbow.
and it was full of theft, burglary, forgery, and the charge of sexual intercourse with a child.
Yep.
They then pulled out a mugshot, and it was a photo of a rather handsome man with grayish hair, angular features, and deep-set dark eyes, which matched the description that Brenda White had given of the man she maced.
Right.
So John and Regina quickly took everything they had just found to Detective Westphalen. He decided they were definitely onto something, and they put together a photo lineup of 6 mugshots and asked the officers to go back and take them to Brenda White.
Okay.
Immediately, they tracked Brenda down on her usual street corner and asked her if she recognized any of the men in the mugshots. She didn't hesitate at all and pointed straight to Charles Albright's picture.
Okay.
She said, "That's the man who attacked me."
Good. This is kind of unrelated, but not really. You said Detective Westphalen, and I swear we mentioned this detective before. We need to look back and see what other cases he was connected to.
He very well could have been Kenneth McDuff because he was a lead homicide detective in Dallas, and Kenneth was there doing stuff too.
Okay.
Around the same time, because there's always multiple serial killers.
Yep.
A little while later, they showed the same lineup to Veronica Rodriguez. When she got to the third picture of Charles Albright, she started trembling. She suddenly got fearful, and she just refused to identify anyone. The patrol officers called Detective Westphalen with the news, and he knew if he could not give Veronica a break, he wouldn't have the evidence to go after Charles. So the officers brought Veronica downtown, and that is where the detective shared with her about the 3 girls that had been brutally killed and that they wanted to get the killer off the street. And that is when she cooperated, and she quickly pointed to Charles Albright as the man who had picked her up and taken her to the field.
Okay.
At 2:30 in the morning on March 22nd, a team of tactical officers burst through the front door of 1035 El Dorado. As Charles Albright was handcuffed and led away, he never said a word. Stumbling out of bed in her nightgown, Dixie looked incredulously at Charles and then back at the police. She had no idea what the man she loved could have done.
Oh, boy. But they know about the other properties, right? So they're going to get to those eventually.
Yes. For a long time after Charles Albright's arrest, everyone involved in this case wondered wondered if they would be able to find enough evidence to convict him of murder. Despite an all-night interrogation with good cop, bad cop, all of that, he refused to confess to anything. He acted as if he had never heard the names of the murdered women, but the police were able to search every square inch of his South Dallas properties, and they also searched his Oak Cliff home 6 times.
Okay.
They even brought in a high-tech machine that could see through walls.
Oh, cool.
The searches produced an array of interesting items: carpenters, woodworking blades, X-Acto blades, a copy of Grey's Anatomy, at least a dozen true crime books. They never came up with the eyeballs.
Oh, man. Okay.
Behind Charlie's hand-built fireplace mantle, police discovered a hidden compartment filled with pistols and rifles, but none turned out to be the murder weapon.
Okay, just another strange collection. Hopefully he didn't eat them or something.
Ew. Well, I think one of the detectives said maybe he was eating them.
Yeah, like a power thing.
Who knows? On top of having no evidence, Dixie claimed that on the nights in question, Charlie did not leave the house early for his paper route and that he always came home on time. So she was trying to give him an alibi. As the trial date arrived, Veronica Rodriguez was supposed to be the witness, but she changed her story, we think because she got afraid. She claimed that she and Charles had never been together and that Detective Westphalen had coerced her into picking Charles' photograph from the lineup.
Interesting. She seemed a little scared and skittish, and they weren't listening to her before.
Yeah, I can never blame anyone who doesn't want to face their abductor.
No, of course not.
For the first time in its history, the DA's office was going for a murder conviction based solely on controversial evidence, which was a hair sample.
Oh.
Days after Charles' arrest, the city's forensic lab reported that hairs were found on the bodies of the 3 women, and they were similar to hair samples taken from Charles' head and pubic area. As evidence goes, we know hair is not as conclusive as fingerprints. It's impossible to tell how many other gray-haired men's hairs might look similar to Charles under a microscope, but they were also able to connect hairs found on the blankets in the back of Charles' pickup truck. And these hairs were similar to hair samples from Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson.
Oh, okay.
They also found hair in Charles' vacuum cleaner that matched the hair from Shirley Williams.
Oh, okay.
So they had multiple hairs. And then they got an additional piece of the puzzle from Regina Smith and John Matthews. They interviewed another sex worker, Tina Connolly, who claimed that Charles was one of her regular customers. She usually saw him in the afternoon, so she was shocked when she saw him cruising after dark one day. She knew his car, and that was the night that Shirley Williams disappeared.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good one.
She also took the 2 officers to a secluded field near Fort Worth Boulevard, and she said that Charles would always take her there for sex.
And that's the same field.
Maybe. But while they were in that field, they spotted a yellow raincoat.
Oh, okay.
Just like the one that Shirley was last seen wearing, and they found a blanket.
Okay.
Hairs on both the coat and the blanket matched Charles' hair.
Okay.
So this whole case is going to be decided by hair.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Which is controversial, but there's so much of it that I think it fits.
Yeah. Well, it's not the only evidence. There's girls pointing to him. He's a regular in the area.
Yeah.
He disappears in the middle of the night for a newspaper route. Like,
yeah,
it fits.
It all fits. Charles' defense attorney tried to convince the jury that the case against Charles depended on flimsy circumstantial evidence. The killer, he said, was probably Axton Schindler, who just happened to skip town the week of the trial.
I'm not going to lie. It's in my head.
Admittedly, the police did have many unanswered questions about Axton. Detective Westphalen had spent hours interrogating him, trying to determine if he assisted Charles in the killings or was at least aware that Charles was murdering women on the rental property. But there was nothing to tie him to the case except for an empty .44 caliber bullet box found behind the house, which Charles could have dropped that there himself.
Okay.
When Axton and Charles' photos were shown to dozens of sex workers in the area, none of them recognized Axton, but almost all of them recognized Charles.
Okay.
And there weren't any hairs found on the bodies or the blanket or anything that could be linked back to Axton Schindler.
Okay.
And most importantly, no one who had ever met Axton could imagine he would have the slightest skill required to perfectly remove a set of human eyes.
Yeah, he's not exactly clean with things.
maybe he was suspicious and didn't say anything. It is odd that he skipped town, but also maybe he was afraid he would get dragged into something. I don't know.
Did he skip town or did he go to work? Because he is a trucker.
I guess he never came back. He
okay.
He moved out of the house and left. Charles never testified. Throughout the trial, he sat quietly in his chair. In closing arguments, the prosecutor just relayed to the jury that this was a very smart man. He went through all of the different things that Charles had done throughout his life. And he said that Charles was a risk and that if he ever got out of jail, he would learn from his mistakes and continue killing and not get caught.
Yeah, it's very true.
On December 19th, the jury returned with a guilty verdict for Charles and convicted him only in the murder of Shirley Williams because that was the one with the most evidence. They did find her raincoat.
Right. Okay.
I think they just felt like they couldn't. And they also knew that if they could convict him on one, it would keep him in jail. The judge ordered him to serve a life imprisonment sentence without the possibility of parole.
But that's not true because people who are sentenced to life without the possibility of parole get out all the time. If it was multiple women, it is a harder sentence.
The charges he faced for the murders of Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson were later dropped because the prosecution did not have enough evidence to prove.
Okay.
Though he is still considered to be the prime suspect.
Right.
Upon hearing the decision, Dixie collapsed in the courtroom.
Of course. I mean, God, how do you even reconcile with that?
I don't know. Charles Albright's friends, who had been there to support him, avoided reporters in the courthouse hallway. It was as if they did not want to be blamed for having lived with a vicious killer without recognizing him for what he was. His defense attorney began saying that he would get Charles acquitted and that it was a miscarriage of justice and an innocent man was convicted.
When you hear stuff like that, then you have to believe that the lawyer actually truthfully believes that he is innocent, because otherwise, why would you want him out on the street to kill more people?
I think that Charles was just a very convincing guy. Yeah, he just came across as such a nice person. So he was convicted and he was locked away. In August of 2020, Charles Albright was serving his sentence at the West Texas Regional Facility in Lubbock, Texas, when he passed away at the age of 87.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's right. This started a long time ago.
Yeah, he was convicted in 1991. He never saw the light of day again, thank God.
That's good.
Was not able to get his hands on anyone else. I do believe he was probably hurting other women, like I said, because this started in his 50s.
Yeah.
There are other women who are thought to be victims of Charles. One of the biggest ones was a woman who was killed. She was also a sex worker. It was, I think, around 5 years prior to Mary Pratt's murder, but she was only stabbed to death and her eyeballs were kept in. So it could have just been him trying it out.
Yeah.
There were no other women that we know of where the eyeballs were removed. So I don't know, maybe it was just something snapped in him. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of questions. Like I said, there's been a lot of interviews with him. He will always deny it. He will say he's squeamish. He even told one reporter that he had never touched an eyeball and the thought of it was just gross.
But he did with the animals and he was going to med school.
I know. It's stupid. And he also told one reporter that the boys in the forensics lab were the ones that cut out the eyeballs to frame him because they wanted some kind of sensationalized story.
Okay.
So he was delusional. Mm-hmm. Nobody really knows why he did what he did or why he had this obsession with eyes, but we can all theorize. Mm-hmm. He never admitted at any time or showed any remorse for these 3 women that we know he most likely killed.
Yeah.
So that is my story of Charles Albright, the eyeball killer. I hope we never see someone like him again. He was able to just completely pull the wool over everyone's eyes while he lived this double life and hurt these women.
I mean, what another wild one. My goodness. He is definitely a really interesting character. You had me rooting him on for the first half, but he obviously had some massive issues with women, and I'm really sorry for those girls because they trusted him. He them to trust him.
Yeah, he roped them in.
Yeah,
and was their sugar daddy or whatever, and then they went with him like they had probably dozens of times before.
I just feel bad for the other girls who didn't have justice to their deaths and it was dropped because now there's nothing.
I know. And thank God that Brenda and Veronica got away because he would have had 5 victims.
That's very true.
If those girls hadn't fought back.
And that Regina had a heart for those women on the streets.
Regina is a big hero of this story because she's the one that solved it.
Yep.
It wasn't the detectives. And there is a highlight about her. I think it was on the Oxygen channel. They did this case and she's just a really remarkable woman.
Yep.
And she went into being a police for the right reasons. So I know sometimes we put cops down on this show, but there are some out there for the right reasons.
Right. And we'll lift them up when they are good. But unfortunately, a lot are bad.
So that's my serial killer story. I can tell you my next episode is not a serial killer. So we'll break out of the pattern for a minute.
Well, not next week.
Uh-oh.
But it's only alleged.
Oh, okay. So we got another serial killer coming next week? Maybe.
I think so.
Okay.
Well, thank you for telling this story. I had never heard about it before.
I don't even remember how I came across it.
Yeah. I just remember you saying, hey, I'm going to use this for my mini episode lab report. And I was like, okay. And then you're like, just kidding. I just wrote 10 pages. So moving on.
I really don't know how I came across this guy now that I think about it. But I did.
Weird.
And I was going to do a mini episode.
Probably TikTok.
Probably. That's where we get most things. Speaking of TikTok, I mean, it may all go away for us, they're saying, in another month anyways. We are still figuring out where we will live in the future.
Or we will live in the ether.
Yes. But until then, you can find us via email. We would love to hear from you. That is lucidlabpodcast@gmail.com.
You can also mail us anything at P.O. Box 251 East Lake, Colorado 80614. Yep. And we would love it if you would leave a review and give us some shiny yellow stars.
We love them. And in the meantime,
stay lucid.
Bye.
Adios.